When the Civil War started, some Louisianians could still remember a time when their home first became a part of the United States. But now they were breaking away from the American nation. No one could have foreseen the degree of devastation that the war would bring. When it was over, Louisiana was reconstructed as a part of the United States once again. But the violence, corruption, and social upheaval of that period left scars on the state, some of which remain with us even today.
Every one of us loved that flag. The flag of the United States had been our flag, and yet we felt it must go, and our flag rise in its place.
On January 9th, 1861, a band of Louisianians armed themselves and boarded the steamboat National in New Orleans, then headed north to Baton Rouge. Without firing a shot, they seized the U.S. Army's arsenal there and claimed it for the state of Louisiana. They were acting under the orders of the governor, Thomas Overton Moore.
The safety of the state of Louisiana demands that I take possession of all government property within her limits. With a large force at my disposal, this demand will be enforced. Any attempt at defense on your part will be a rash sacrifice of life.
From public edifices, hotels, and private buildings, the Pelican flag was hoisted and displayed its ample folds to the breeze. The church bells proclaimed the news of secession in vibrating tones, whilst the deep voice of the cannon announced it even more loudly.
Louisiana soon discovered that cannons sound different when fired not in celebration, but at her countrymen. On April 12, 1861, Confederate artillery opened fire on the Union's Fort Sumter in South Carolina. Southern forces were led by General Gustave Beauregard, previously an officer in the United States Army from St. Bernard Parish. Shortly afterwards, Beauregard would lead the Confederate forces to victory in the first major battle of the Civil War at Manassas. Louisiana claimed the Confederacy's first war hero. After secession, Louisiana joined with 10 other southern states in forming a new nation, the Confederate States of America. Now that the war had begun, the Confederacy's president, Jefferson Davis, asked Louisiana to furnish several thousand troops for immediate deployment. The state responded generously. At the start of the war, some 24,000 Louisianians volunteered to fight for the South, more than any other state except Virginia.
We are sending the very princes of our land, men of family, men whose loss will be deplored by the whole community.
Louisiana's armies were a reflection of her people, colorful and diverse. Unlike other parts of the South, immigrants made up at least 10% of the state's inhabitants. So along with native-born Louisianians, companies were composed of men from around the world, Irish, Italian, even Slavic soldiers. Perhaps most surprising to some were the many free blacks who volunteered to defend Confederate Louisiana. By 1862, more than 3,000 free men of color had joined the Louisiana militia, known as the Native Guard.
This was their home. They did have affection for it, but it was also their business, their work, people they knew. It was a reaction to what they considered to be a threat to their way of life.
They were slave owners, they were property owners, and I think that in many instances, they operated as you or I would operate, or as anyone would operate, and that is according to your purse or your pocketbook.
But of the thousands of young men who eagerly stepped forward to fight, few were prepared for the horrors that this war would inflict upon them and their homeland.
Although there was this sort of feeling that one Southerner could whip 5 Yankees or 5 Northerners. They had no idea what it would actually be like when war came along, what it would take to sustain the armies in the field, what it would entail as far as losing fathers, sons, and brothers in combat. They just had no clue what a long war was going to be like.
I had my name enrolled with the list of volunteers for service in the Confederate States of America. I am willing to shed the last drop of my blood on the altar of my country, if that could be the means of saving us from Northern treachery.
In the Florida parishes, Camp Moore became the main training ground for Louisiana's soldiers. But fighting off hunger and disease, troops began to worry more about dying in their tents than on the battlefield.
I was astonished by the change. Of the 600 who first arrived, there are now but about 250. Everywhere it's diarrhea, chills, and fever.
Throughout Louisiana, people of every class and color pitched in to help needy soldiers and their families. Before long, however, many at home could no longer help themselves.